Welcome to Back Talk, the premier podcast from Successful Black Parenting Magazine, featuring in-depth conversations and expert insights on crucial topics for Black families. We are ranked one of the top 4 Black family podcasts on FeedSpot, and we're now number 1 on Million Podcasts as well. I'm your host, Janice Robinson-Celeste, and now Successful Black Parenting Magazine has an interactive community of like-minded Black parents called the Black Parenting Academy, where you can converse and post questions, comments, wins, and concerns in a safe space. And I will be sharing that link later during the show, so make sure you watch for it. What happens to a child's future when a diagnosis is misapplied or misunderstood, or just simply because of the color of their skin? We're going to talk about it next.
This is Back Talk by Successful Black Parenting Magazine, the most listened to podcast for parents by parents.
Hello, Successful Black parents. Thank you for tuning in to Back Talk by Successful Black Parenting Magazine, your go-to podcast talk show for parents. We are live right now. We're live, and that means you can post your questions in the comment section of our Facebook or YouTube pages, and I will address your questions live on air. So don't forget to share our podcast with your friends right now. Do it right now. Shout it out to your followers, because sharing is truly caring. And don't forget to use the hashtag BackTalk when you post. That way people can find us. So today in the studio is Michelle Pianim. So I want to invite you to the show, Michelle, and welcome you. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be with you today.
Can you introduce yourself, as you know yourself better than anyone else, and you've done so many great things? Just tell us a little bit about your journey in special education and school leadership.
Yeah, so I am in my 23rd year of special education. So I'm a career special educator. Started just like a lot of folks as a teacher in what I would consider high-incidence classrooms, autism, intellectual disabilities. We used to call it mental retardation, right? So we've renamed it an intellectual disability. But so I started out there, and then once I moved back to the DC area, I worked for the superintendent in the special education department, and really got an opportunity to see how special education was functioning, in different states, and the over-identification of Black boys specifically, but Black children, and made it my goal to try to educate as much as possible. Over the last 8 years, though, I have been a special ed consultant to schools across the nation to try to help with things like compliance, and also being an expert in teaching folks how to properly teach students with disabilities, and how to remove some of the bias from what we're doing in education. That's probably still the biggest concern that I have.
I'm sure you've seen a lot of biases in your tenure, so we're going to talk about that. But before we get into it, I always have this icebreaker for our guests, and I always ask, what's something about you that most people don't know, even those who work with you professionally?
What's something about me that most people don't know? I think that when you are a consultant, it almost seems like you are an extreme extrovert. But I am a true introvert. And COVID actually proved that I could stay home all the time and never go out the house. I love being home. So I'm a true introvert, and I love being at home.
Really? Oh, it's interesting. I always say I'm an introvert, extrovert, because I'm an extrovert when I have to be.
Yes.
And I don't know if you can relate to this, but when I'm home, I'm happy being home, and I don't really want to go out. And so when people invite me out, I'm like, I don't really want to go. But then I get there and I have a good time, and I'm like, why am I like this? And it rinses and repeats, right? Every
Yes.
time. Yeah. Okay. So you're part of my tribe. Got it. It's so strange. I don't understand it, but it's just a little quirk that I don't know that I have. So I'm glad to know it's other people as well.
It's good to be in like company.
Yes. Let me ask you, why are Black children so often over identified in categories like emotional disturbance and ADHD? And what's driving this?
Yeah, so I think one, I think a lot of families don't realize that it's very easy to diagnose into emotional disturbance. It is just a small questionnaire. Two, I think there's a when we talked about bias a little bit earlier and didn't go so deeply into it, but we still have a nation where 80 to 85% of our teachers are white, right? So we walk in with that bias of, you know, this child is moving too much, this child is running around, this child is not listening, um, and they happen to be Black. It's like, oh, they have a behavioral disorder.
Mhm.
And we find that we don't do the necessary tests to see, is this child dyslexic? Are they having, trouble reading? Are they having trouble functioning well in this environment? Those extra steps aren't taken to try to see, is this an academic thing? And then can we kind of solve the behavioral by doing more tests to figure out whether this is academic? Um, I don't know if you remember a time when we used to say, oh, Black children come into schools with a 50,000 word deficit. That used to be very common, where their vocabulary was much lower to children, like, children their age, but different races. And so I've always said to folks, if you know that there is a vocabulary deficit, the number one driver of reading is vocabulary. When our vocabulary is higher, we read better. And so I've always said, well, why haven't we looked into that first? But that bias takes over, and it's like, oh, the child has behavioral problems. I want them out of my space. I want a reprieve from them. So we see that over identification, especially in high incidence behaviors, OHI, other health impairment for ADHD, or emotional disturbance, where once they go into that, once they have that category or that label, they're out of the classroom more. And so that academic gap is just widening. So what we see in high school, especially, is most students with an emotional disturbance category are below about 5 to 6 years. They're 5 to 6 years behind.
Wow. Why do you think the vocabulary words are a deficit when Black children go into school?
So I don't actually see that as true. I think those were older studies. I
I
think
see.
Black children come in a comparable space, but we've removed a lot of play from schools now. We're doing a lot of sitting, and I don't know if you've been around a 4 or 5 year old lately, but they're pretty active, right?
Yeah, as they should be.
I think it's I think we look more into why a white child is active, and we don't diagnose or don't label that
Mhm.
emotional disturbance the way we do, and that's where the bias comes in with Black children. I don't necessarily think they have a language deficit. I think we see a little bit of a vocabulary deficit when students are covering a lot of different socioeconomic status. So maybe they're,
Okay.
in an underserved community with a food desert, and they may be, on the lower socioeconomic status side, then maybe their parents didn't get to read to them as much because they have multiple jobs or whatever.
Mhm.
I don't want to assume anything, but it is quickly made up in those spaces because pre-K is a thing, right?
Right.
Preschool, they go to pre-K. I don't see it as so much as a deficit. I think we use that as a marker to further identify students.
That's funny that you say that. It made me think years ago, many, many years ago. And I went to pre-K, I went to Head Start and all of that. But I remember being in high school, and I went to integrated high school when it came time for the PSATs and SATs. I wanted to know why these white girls had the vocabulary down and I didn't. Like, I had
Mhm.
never heard these words before in my life. And then I realized as I became more mature that these kids, these white families often they take their kids around the world. They get worldly
Yeah.
vocabulary. They go skiing. They go places that make them learn new vocabulary words, as well as they get tutors and all that kind of stuff, where I didn't have that. So I always wondered about that. I'm wondering, why do we have this somewhat of a vocabulary deficit when you compare
Mhm.
what they have? But they also, have a lot of them have the means, not all of them, but they have tutors, and one, especially in the school I was at, because it was a Catholic girls' high school. So I
Yeah.
can understand it. But yeah, so that's interesting that you say that. Do you think it might also be the way we teach? Like you alluded to it with the 4-year-old. Why is a 4-year-old sitting in the classroom and can't walk around and learn like in a Montessori or
Mhm.
somewhat like an open or project based classroom? I know that we do better with project based learning. So do you
Yes.
think maybe that might have something to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, so you're kind of hitting the nail on the head, and I don't know that we want to get there's a little bit of there's some controversy behind some of this. Like when we look at, I live in an area that's close to DC, and DC has about 60 different charter schools, right? But they also have a functioning District of Columbia Public Schools, right? So they have a functioning district, and they have 60 different charter schools around the city. Um, what we find though is that schools that are predominantly Black children that wear uniforms, that walk in lines, that have to ask to get up, um, to throw something in the trash, they're robotic, right? They're regimented.
Yeah.
White people aren't sending their kids to those schools. And
Interesting.
they are sending their kids to, you know, the Montessori schools or the schools where there's no uniform and there's project based learning. And you come into the school and you see all the kids. You see all the kids on the floor learning and
Yeah.
building and doing those things. And so there's some equity amongst um, what looks pretty on the outside versus what's happening on the inside. And we've got to, kind of build that up in a way that says like, here's the way my child learns best and how do I get them there, even if I don't have the means. I know a bunch of wealthy African American or Black families who want these same things for their families, but in order to get to middle class or even upper middle class, they work a lot, right? And so that tutoring, that traveling around the world, that life experience. I even compared myself. This is a small little side note. I have 3 daughters. They're 10, 15, and 20. My oldest is at Howard University studying to be a speech pathologist, right?
SHBC.
And she's fluent in French. She's doing all the things. Once I started my consulting business, I slowed down on some of the things. We used to go to museums every weekend. We used to, travel internationally. And I slowed down a little bit because I got super busy. And I've noticed that my 10-year-old is a lot different um, in terms of her inquisitiveness, her
Mhm.
questions than my 20-year-old. And I said, okay, I've got to get back to where we were, just because I see how that exposure to multiple cultures, to information changed my oldest daughter, right? Um, I think there's little things that we can do that are free that we could just get our children exposed to. Like you said, well traveled and tutors and all those things. I think we try to do them, but I don't know if there's a perfect formula either.
Yeah, I mean, the more we can do, the you know better our kids are. Like especially, I believe in traveling with your kids. I
Yeah.
know a lot of people always want like they want to leave the kids home. I've seen that. I'm like, take your kids. I know you need time to
Mhm.
yourself, and I'm all for that. But when you can, even if you take them to a museum and you do a staycation, the more they get out, the more they experience, the more words that become part of their vocabulary, which will help them later in life. So do it. It's really important. I just want to acknowledge Alice for being part of our tribe. So thank you, Alice, for sharing that. Thank you so much. So, can you explain maybe the difference between a true learning disability and a behavioral diagnosis, and how can these be confused, especially when race is a factor? You talked about it a little bit, but what's the difference?
Yeah, so when we look at learning disabilities, if you were just to look at the qualification worksheets, it asks you, is the student 2 or more years below in this core content? That could be in math, reading, or writing. And so let's give, an example of a fourth grader who may be functioning at a first or second grade level. Now, right now in today's education landscape, it's actually a lot harder to qualify that because we had such a gap in learning a few years ago, right? So we're
Hmm.
trying to figure out, was it a lack of appropriate instruction, which is a question to qualify students, Or do you actually have an inability to learn at the pace that we are expecting in a traditional grade school? So we would want to collect as much data as possible to try to figure out, even with high quality instruction, right? This child is in school every day. The teacher is there. They are pushing instruction. Data is showing other kids are moving at a rate that looks, as satisfactory, and this baby is not, right? So then we're saying, okay, is it like a dyslexia, dyscalculia? Like, is it reading? Is it math? So we're wanting to do all of those kind of test indicators, right? Do evaluations in that area. What happens though is a lot of times schools can just take the 2 years. They're 2 years behind. They qualify for a specific learning disability. We're going to qualify them. The misstep happens, and I know this isn't intentional with schools, but right now there's this teacher shortage, right? So say the student needs 6 hours of specialized instruction. That means with a special ed teacher for 6 hours a week. Does that special ed teacher have that capacity? Do they have enough staff in the building? Are they delivering high quality instruction during those 6 hours? Is there a remedial intervention being driven that's teaching, decoding, encoding, vocabulary, all of those things that a student might need to be able to read at a higher level, right? When we look at behavior, though, behavior can be, I've seen, and I know this is insane, I've seen students qualify for a behavioral disorder for throwing ketchup across the cafeteria. So it's something that like I said, that's where that bias comes in, because it's like, does the student have a behavioral disorder? Do they have a rough morning? Do they have trauma? Um, are they just frustrated and don't have the ability to communicate that frustration because they don't have the words? There's a number of things that we also should be looking at, but a lot of times we fall short on going the extra mile to collect that data.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Yeah.
That's amazing that you can have a bad day. But I've heard also people, even Black people, experts say that our kids aren't diagnosed enough, especially for things like autism. So what
Yeah.
do you have to say about that?
Yeah. So I think autism is something that's booming, right?
Mhm.
Right now, I see in urban city, we're talking about Chicago, DC, Atlanta, LA, cities with a lot of African American families, or even a mix, diverse culturally and racially. We're seeing 1 in 4 students in classrooms are diagnosed with autism or some sort of sensory disorder. So autism diagnoses are on the rise. I do see, though, that Black children are underdiagnosed for things like dyslexia. We do not do the appropriate testing to figure out whether there is an actual verified reading disorder, or whether they're behind the mark in areas like that. And so you can imagine, if you're in, let's just put ourselves in a simulation, right? We're in another country. They only speak that language. We don't understand anything that's happening. We're unable to communicate with them. We're frustrated. It's been a long day. We're just trying to get food, maybe shelter, whatever. So let's say we put ourselves in that type of simulation. Imagine a child in the classroom and you are speaking high leverage words, and they've never heard these words a day in their life. They don't know what's happening in that classroom. They don't know what's expected of them. And they come in and they're just like, I am overstimulated. I'm overwhelmed. I don't know how to ask for help. And so I'm going to cry underneath the table, or I'm going to scream, or I'm going to run out the classroom. That's the very first indicator that something is happening. But usually our teachers and our administrators are saying, well, he needs to behave. He needs to get back in that classroom. He needs to be sitting down, instead of saying, like, what happened in there, bud? Okay, talk to me about how you're feeling. Any of that, those steps are often missed. And we're saying, oh, he's a behavior issue, so he needs to go in this special classroom.
Okay. Well, you kind of segue into my next
Oh,
question because you talked about the signs for teachers, but what about for parents? How early do these misdiagnoses typically start, and what signs should Black parents look for to intervene sooner?
yeah. So that's hard because I think that well, well, let me say this. I, as a special educator, definitely look for, signs for my children, right? Like,
Mhm.
are you functioning at a rate that I think is normal, right? But that sort of got debunked when I had a second child, and she didn't do all the things that the first child did. So I would tell parents, like, look at your child's mannerisms, right? So are they giving really big smiles? Do they make eye contact? Um, can they focus on a task? If you were to give them an alphabet task, or even some type of Play-Doh, and you say, I want you to do this, can they stay on task that long? And it shouldn't be any longer than the minutes they are old. We should not be expecting for children to sit for 30 minutes at 3 years old. And that's an unrealistic expectation. So looking at what can my child do in the time that I'm asking them to do it, what are some of the points of frustration that I have as a parent, and then what does that actually look like? And then also, when we think about speech disorders, a lot of times we as parents can understand our children, but other folks cannot.
Yes.
That's a big, if someone's saying, like, what did he say? What did he say? And they're 4 or 5 years old,
Well,
you know,
she was 3, so but she's fine. Go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, and you say, what did they say? What did he say? Then it's like, oh, maybe we just want to get a screening. And that's something that you can ask for. I think what I will tell you is that if you, as a parent, ever have just a small concern, you're saying, um, I think they should be doing this, but they're not, or um, my child is doing XYZ and I don't see any of his peers doing that, or the daycare raised this concern. At 3 years old, your local school district can screen your children. You should not be paying out of pocket for evaluations of any sort. You can go to your local Head Start, like you said, or early intervention
Hmm.
um, within your district, and say, I have a 3-year-old, I have these concerns, and I would like them to be screened and or evaluated. Just the way that as Black women for maternal health that we have to say, oh, I want you to note in my file that you refuse to do XYZ test. I think as parents, we should be willing to say that. I would like in writing that you are refusing to test my child based on XYZ concerns.
It's great advice, and that it should be free if you're in your local school district. That's important,
Yeah.
very important. So I'm sure you've seen it all. So what harmful consequences have you witnessed when a Black child is misdiagnosed or labeled too early or incorrectly?
Yeah. So, what we see a lot of times, especially for an emotional disturbance diagnosis, is that what I find is our parents. I don't know if you grew up with this, but my dad always said, don't come home and tell me anything because the teacher is always right.
Yes,
Okay.
you changed that now, though.
Yes. And some of us have changed.
Hmm.
But I would say I would encourage our families to understand that educators are also not always experts.
Right.
Do your research, right? But leading to your question around harmful effects, when I look at emotional disturbance trajectories, right? And this is sort of what my dissertation is on, but I have tried to do some research around the wellness of Black men post a incorrect emotional disturbance diagnosis. Almost 90% of them end up in some sort of incarceration or court related or adjudication type of program. And so we're looking at a high incidence of either criminal activity or expected criminal activity, right? They are still using third grade data to build prisons. And so when we think about whether our children are reading on grade level at third grade, that is the indicator of whether they will end up incarcerated at some point. That emotional disturbance diagnosis or even ADHD raises that bar even more. So we're looking at higher dropout rate, likelihood to be incarcerated or somehow system involved, and then what ends up as the result of that is lower income and poverty, right? So we see that they are not high earners. They don't end up in a two-parent nuclear family for their own children with high income. It just sort of is a cycle that ends up being repeated.
And there's a name for that. It's called pre-K to prison pipeline, and specifically talks about Black students.
Yeah.
And it starts in pre-K and goes through school, and basically they end up hating school anyway. So
Yeah.
they drop out, and then just becomes a spiral from there.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
see that most of all in my research around ED diagnosis. When we have an emotional disturbance diagnosis, then you are, more likely to fall into that statistical data. I think the other thing that I want parents to really understand is even if you don't want an emotional disturbance diagnosis, and this is a simulation that I try to, present when I present to parents, I will say, if I walked up to you, Janice, and said, I have an emotional disorder or I have an emotional disturbance diagnosis, and you may assume certain things about me just from learning that. You may say, oh, she's on medication. Maybe she's seeing a psychiatrist. Maybe she's unstable. I need to, be aware, right? Maybe just that may be your assumption. But when we say that about a child, they have an emotional disturbance diagnosis, what are we expecting adults to think about that child? Yeah. What are we expecting them to expect from that child? Are we expecting them to still give the 100% knowing that they are unstable, unpredictable, likely on medication, whatever we would think about an adult? Do we still have that same indicator for children? And the reality of it is children can tell when you think a certain thing about them, the way that you treat them, the way that you function around them. They pick up energy just the way adults do. And I just really struggle when we say, okay, we have given this child a label prematurely. I work with an all-Black charter school in DC, and they start in fourth grade. 44% of their incoming fourth grade last year, all Black boys already had an IEP.
That's too high, way too high.
Half of them,
it can't be accurate.
Yeah, and half of them, it was emotional disturbance.
Statistically, that cannot be. Wow.
Yeah.
You know what? And you know what? Labeling, I just want to say for the parents out there, labeling actually can work the opposite way too, which is what you wanted to do. And I know I've used it. I called it my hack going through high school because I tell you it was integrated high school, so I would struggle to get a B when I knew I had B, at least A work. Yeah. And so if it was like on a border, especially of a B and an A, I would every time go to the teacher and say, "Hey, I'm an A student."
Yeah.
Right. I became an A student after that, but I was not at the time. And I was, I'm an A student. I cannot have B's. And I would be after class, I cannot have B's. So why did you give me a B? I don't understand. This is an essay. No. And then so, because they knew I would go argue with them.
Yes.
They moved. If there was a question of whether it should be a B or A, I always got the A after that. Yep. And because they knew I was an A student in their head. So, and I'm a teacher, so I know that works. So it does. And then my mom, I love that. My mom came to bat for me in 6th grade when my teacher, which became my favorite teacher after this, but my teacher told her she didn't think I could do the work.
Oh.
Right? My mom went up. I've never seen her so mad. And she went up there and defended me and said she can do whatever she puts her mind to. And she is a smart girl. And you are going to give her a chance to do this and do this work. She can do it. And she got me back there and got my butt from being lazy. And I did the work. And she's the reason, that teacher's the reason I'm a writer today, because I had her twice. Yeah, I had her in 6th grade and 8th grade, and we had the same names. So her name is Janice Marie. My name's Janice Marie, which is amazing. But she's the reason I'm a writer. But those labels can work the opposite way. So if you know they can work that way, just imagine a detriment
Agree.
that can
Agree.
happen if they label your child incorrectly.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So there's also a flip side to that too. You brought up a good point. There are families that even I engage with who say like, "Oh, I don't want my son or my daughter to have a label. I know how the world treats labels, right? Whatever they are." But that child really needs it, right? They
Mhm.
really need the support. A lot of times we can get in our own way of our child getting support. I think what really matters is not the label, it's how much you engage with that team on
Mhm.
whether your child is getting exactly what they said you would at that meeting. So really understanding, what are the services that you are proposing for my child? What does this mean at the end of this year? So every meeting that you go to, I would encourage parents to say, I would like to talk about last year's goals. Did they master those goals? How much of a gap did we close? Where is my child functioning compared to last year? If we're in sixth grade and we were on a fourth grade level last year, say we're at 4.8, so we're at the end of fourth grade level, are they on the fifth grade level now? Did they grow?
Mhm.
Did the what you proposed work? And so I think parents asking those pushing or pressing questions around, prove to me that the program that you asked to implement worked for my child. And if it did not, what are our next steps? So parents actually showing up and saying, if we're going to put this in place, here are the things that I need to feel like it's working.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you said that because I was about to say, and people who watch, they know my grandson is autistic, and he's a genius.
Yeah.
So what does a label mean? He's
Yeah.
a genius, but when people hear he's autistic, they don't think much of it. Like they think, oh, well, he can't do this. The boy is a genius.
Yes.
Absolutely, he's going
A
to
human
be an
calculator.
amazing adult because, and I have a feeling he's going to be a scientist, something because or engineer because the way he just thinks differently, and it's that different thinking is needed in this world.
Yeah.
So there's that. I just wanted to make that point. Yes,
Yeah.
labeled means it doesn't mean they can't do.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, but the label also matters, and
Mhm,
for another extreme, the label really matters when your child has extreme behaviors. So
mhm,
say me as a parent, I come to the school and I say, I'm actually struggling Michelle at home. So I'll use my name for example.
mhm,
And I'll say like, I'm actually struggling with Michelle at home. She leaves the house every night. She hit me last week. Let's say this is a hypothetical.
okay,
Um, she's defiant. She doesn't listen. All of the indicators of ED. Say if she is um, labeled as OHI or specific learning disability, and we come to the table and she's done something egregious in school. Say she's punched a staff member or
wait, tell them what OHI is.
other health impairment for
Okay,
like it's an umbrella diagnosis for things like Tourette's,
okay,
ADHD, sickle cell. You can have a number of different life
mhm,
impaired or health impairments under there. So say your child is diagnosed with ADHD, and so other health impairment is on their first page of their IEP, or they have specific learning disability, but they have egregious behaviors. When you come to a meeting like a MDR, which is a manifestation determination review, which normally happens if you're going to get more than 10 days suspension or if you're going to get expelled. If your
mhm,
child is listed as a specific learning disability and this behavior has been continuous, there's a history of this type of, violent or you know, egregious outbursts, it is really hard for that to school to say, no, this is an indicator of their disability.
hmm,
So having the correct disability classification is just as important as parent advocacy, because once you have, like, say if the student really is ED and they have an ED diagnosis, that parent can say all of these things were the reason why we came to the decision at the triennial or at the eligibility meeting. It's the reason why we said emotional disturbance is the diagnosis. We expected these things. So can you give Michelle a dedicated aide?
yes,
Can you know,
that's important.
put more in place in terms of having her have some more one-on-one time with, a special education teacher? Then you can start to really say, So what should programming look like for my child who has this absolute correct diagnosis, but things aren't being implemented?
Or extra time on tests that are important. That's really a big one, I know.
Extended time, frequent
Yeah,
breaks. So if
yes.
you're expecting to take like a SAT or even most of the country takes something called MAP,
Mhm.
right? MAP testing, which is benchmark testing. They take it 3 times a year. So why can't he do an hour a day or 30 minutes a day for the week instead of 3 hours, three
Yeah,
three
that's
hour
for
sessions
most kids.
integrated? By the third day, he's just clicking. I just be for everything, right?
Right, right, right.
It's not a good indicator. So really being able to look at those accommodations and saying, what does this look like in the classroom for Michelle? And then how are you helping general ed teachers program their lessons to align to what Michelle needs? Those are the questions that we can start asking in meetings. Parents can start saying, okay, what does this actually look like for her? Because we're still having as many outbursts as we were having at the beginning of the year.
And those are good questions to ask. I just want to point out to the listeners and the viewers that I mentioned the Black Parenting Academy at the beginning of the show. I did put the link at the bottom if you are listening to the show. The link is the bit.ly short link. So it's bit.ly/Black Parenting Academy. So if you like these kind of conversations and you want to engage in more conversations like that, go to the Black Parenting Academy. And again, it's the bit.ly link, the short link, the bit.ly/Black Parenting Academy, and join us there. All right, next question. First, I want you to explain what an IEP is to
Okay.
those who might not know.
Yep. So an IEP is an acronym for Individualized Education Programming or Education Plan. When you have gone through the process of either a school member or yourself has said, I have a concern about my child and I want them evaluated, I want tests completed. Once you have reviewed those tests with the team and it has been determined that your child has, a speech and language impairment, let's go with that. So they have a stutter. They have, some language things. They're replacing some letters for other letters, things like that. And so they're going to get, speech every week. Within that IEP is going to be goals aligned to growth. So we want them to master WH sounds or master S sounds, which with a lisp or a stutter, that could be hard. So you have goals within that IEP and you have accommodations. An accommodation could look like what Janice mentioned, extended time, frequent breaks, preferential seating. So I need them to be right next to my desk, right? Or in the front of the classroom so that they can hear better when, we're playing the projector, whatever it is. And so really requesting, knowing your child, saying like, oh, I really do think that they need testing with a familiar adult. So those are things that can happen that can be a part of the IEP, but the IEP should tell you, or any school that encounters any professional, your pediatrician, what the plan is for your child. So do they have a hearing impairment? Where are they starting? If your child is in kindergarten and they're they're not meeting all the kindergarten indicators, that should be in a present level of performance in there. So how are they functioning now? What is our goal to get them to the next step? And what are some of the methods we're going to use to get them there? That's really, and then the important thing is how much time are you spending with my child on these indicators? So on these goals. So are you spending an hour a week, 10 hours a week, 20 hours a week? What I want parents to really acknowledge is that out of general education on an IEP means your child is pulled from class to work on remedial skills or whatever skills. Inside general ed means there's a teacher in there supporting your child specifically. When those high hours of out of general ed happen, that's where we are seeing researchers showing that our gap is widening because you're not getting grade level instruction every day. You're out of that classroom, not hearing the vocabulary, the words, the lessons that your main teacher is trying to teach you. So I would encourage parents, especially when you are, signing an IEP for 24 plus hours out of the classroom, That does not necessarily mean that rapid growth is going to happen. So ask questions about that. What does this look like? Who else will be in there with my child?
Mm-hmm. Again, you segued right into the next question, which is how can parents advocate effectively at IEP meetings or during the special education evaluation process? That's really important.
Yeah, it is. So when you're going through the evaluations, a lot of times you have to put in writing or state to someone, I want my child tested. I think it's really important for parents to ask to speak to that evaluator. So the psychologist or professional, whether it's an occupational therapist, a speech pathologist, I would like to do a rating scale or even an interview. So I want to give background on my concerns about my child. I don't want that. You don't want that part to be blank. You don't want to get to the meeting and they say, we tried to reach out to mom, but we were unsuccessful. Because then you just have a school narrative. You need a home narrative as well. So the way that I would say show up for interviews, ask to speak to those evaluators, ask how long will my child be in testing? Is it going to be 3 hours a day? That's a lot. Can we do this over 2 days? So really advocating in that way. I think the other way that you show up in an evaluation is that you ensure that that school gets it to you in a timely manner. So don't show up to a meeting if you don't have documents. You should get that evaluation, those documents, 5 days to 2 weeks in advance for you to be able to look at them, review them. I don't even care if you put that evaluation through ChatGPT and say, explain this evaluation to me
Great idea.
as if I was a second grader.
Mm-hmm.
Even if you are a highly skilled, person of any nature, it's actually hard language to decipher. So a lot of times, run it through, give it to your pediatrician, ask opinions. You should have enough time to be able to get to an understanding of what this document is saying about your child and asking them to change things if it's not accurate.
Okay. We are running a little long, but if you don't mind, I would like to keep asking some more questions about this. And especially because you're talking about the IEP, we had to defend my grandson because the teacher was new to him, and his trigger is food. You can't take his food away from him early because he will spaz out on you pretty much. Like he's going to go off. And they wanted to put a behavioral designation on his IEP. And we were like, oh no, because he had an incident once because you didn't pay attention to his triggers.
Yes.
So those are kind of
when we told you exactly what would happen. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that behavior designation will follow him for life. So we were like, no, because he had one incident and because you didn't listen.
Yeah. So can I touch on something you just said, which is designation will follow them for life. Mm-hmm. I know we are talking a lot about emotional disturbance, and it is the right fit for the right child. Mm-hmm. But just like when we talked about earlier, when it's misdiagnosed, you potentially are interfering with a student being a child graduating high school and being able to get a security clearance. Mm-hmm. Labeled you as unstable. Can you go into the military if you are labeled emotionally unstable? Can they trust you with a weapon? Those are things that are limiting job opportunities for our children. When you think about the types of growth or types of opportunities you can get with the top secret security clearance, or going into military for artificial intelligence or cybersecurity, at that point, can you actually go if you've been mislabeled, say in 5th grade with an emotional disturbance, and then you graduate high school with that same label? What does it look like? People are going to assume that you're unpredictable, that they cannot, give you certain access.
Right. It's so important. That's why parents, you have to speak up. Don't take everything, they say, if you know better, you know your child. Speak up, please. Yeah. It's imperative to their future. So what role does implicit bias play in how teachers and school psychologists assess our Black children for special education? What is that? What have you seen? I really want to know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've seen it all, but I will tell you that there will be times at meetings where they're going to stand, hold to their stance around what this evaluation is saying. If you are a Black parent who strongly disagrees with an evaluation, there are a number of things you can do. You can get an advocate. A lot of times, most cities have, you know, agencies and or advocacy groups who will do things for you, and then the school ends up paying for it. So I would say look into that. I also think that there is a bit of bias that plays into it when you know that your teacher thinks your child has some sort of behavior disorder and you don't, right?
Right.
So it's what you see at home versus this structure at school that's really, a tug of war, right? What I would say is implicit bias may be there, but you have the right to ask for an independent evaluation if you don't agree with the one that was done by the school. You have a right to an advocate. You also have a right to say, none of these things are things that were spoken, that were talked to me in this process. No one talked to me about these things in this process. And so to have them on the evaluation feels a little bit targeted,
Right. No,
right?
right.
Yeah.
Are there ways that the school system can improve either culturally or structurally to better sort of serve our Black children with exceptionalities? What can they do better?
Yeah. I mean, I think that first we need to acknowledge the over identification, right? The bias that
Mhm.
exists there, right? Secondly, I think that teachers could use more bias training, right? Like,
Mhm.
when I say these words, how does it make you feel? What are the first things you think? You have to do that uncomfortable work of undoing your assumptions about Black children, about Black families. Um, and then holding to the standard. If if a teacher says, I think this child needs an IEP, then what is the administration doing their observations? Are they doing their due diligence? Are you hearing that parent out? And if that parent asks for certain things, are you defensive and why?
Hmm.
So schools have got to get better at saying, even though I'm with this child 5 hours a day, this parent knows this child best, and we are going to be a team. And
Okay.
so, for parents, really just kind of pushing into the space and saying, like, when you do an observation, can I come with you?
I love that.
Can I be in this space too? Can I
Mhm.
see what small group looks like for my child? Can I see what the environment looks like? Just being present. I think schools are less likely to um, try to push a diagnosis or even a lack of services, do less when a parent is present. And so I always tell parents, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. So when you walk in and you are not immediately defensive, you're not immediately arguing, you're not immediately, upset, but you're saying, show me exactly what you're saying. I want to see that also. And, going into the space to just support, I think that goes a long way.
Okay. But what happens when a parent who suspects their child's challenges are being ignored or misunderstood entirely? It's kind of opposite. So what can they do?
Yeah, I think so. I think as a parent, I've been there, right?
Yeah.
My middle daughter, she started school and she was speaking only Spanish. She could read in Spanish, and they said, "Oh, she needs a intervention because she can't read in English." And so I did all the things that I just mentioned, but
Mm.
I also when I sent my emails to the school team, the principal, I CC the district special education person, the district area superintendent. I went on that website and I found out who I should contact as a next step. So I said, okay, if these concerns are not addressed by XYZ date, I'm going to be expecting to hear from Robert or Mr. Whoever, and that sort of got the ball rolling. And so I think that you have to be strategic with I've sent the last 5 emails, and this is not going exactly the way that I imagined, or you guys are not responding appropriately, let's get some more people in here.
Absolutely. Paper trails are so important.
Yes.
So make sure you do that.
Yes. Put it in the email, like as
Yes,
a follow-up to our conversation today.
absolutely. It was a pleasure talking to you. But how can our audience follow your journey and connect with your work through either Fair Green Consulting or on social media? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, Fair Green Consulting is a good way. I also am on all of the socials, and so you'll find them on the website. I also do a special education decoded series that you can sign up for, newsletter that has a parent information for parents and schools, so that we do better by students with disabilities. So I encourage folks to just sign up for that.
Okay, guys, you heard that. So go follow her. Go check out her work. If you need her, you can find her at the website. I put it on the screen, fairgreenconsulting.com. Michelle, I want to thank you for coming on this show. You are a wealth of information.
Thank you. I appreciate you for having me.
And I want to give also a big shout out to all of you out here watching the show today. Thank you so much. And you're going to be able to see this replay of this by just going to our Facebook page or to our YouTube channel. And just know that I need you to share it. It's Back Talk by Successful Black Parenting Magazine. And be sure you follow us on social media. Click on everything. Follows, likes, ads, all of that helps us to survive so we can help you to thrive. And until next time, I wish all of you the best and much success. Take care and thank you for listening, everyone.
Thanks for tuning in to Back Talk by Successful Black Parenting Magazine. We'll see you soon.